I've got a presentation here which I've titled Improve, Intensify, Extend, because in this discussion around density and mobility, I think it is the discussion which dominates almost every project that I'm involved in practice as an architect and as an urban planner. The advice we often give our clients is don't assume you have to grow. Don't assume that your city needs to grow. What it might actually be better doing is improving first and intensifying next. But I was reminded, yes, I did join online from Singapore early last year. And didn't it seem strange then that you had someone talking to you across the airwaves when now it's normal? And we've entered a very, very different place. But I was in Hong Kong in January for the Livability Symposium. And I just wanted to remind myself and remind anyone who might have seen that presentation of where I left off this discussion, which was around livability. And I offered 4 ingredients of livability, which I said we have to have walkability. We have to fundamentally be able to walk around the city. We need sitability, which is the ability to stop and sit down and either rest or have a conversation with someone. Breathability is about the air and the quality of the air that we breathe. We need to have healthy cities, not the kind of pollution that cars and vehicles have given. And lastly, transactability. And on that point, to say, well, fundamentally, why do we have cities? It's so that we can transact. And those transactions are either social or they're economic. But we have cities for the reason of transaction. It's so that people every day can come together formally and informally, usually informally, often at the end of the day, to do what these people are doing here in London, which is to be together, to communicate, to interact, and then to transact, because the deal is done. It's either a social deal, it's a friendship, or it's an economic deal. It's about someone perhaps creating a startup company, perhaps making a deal about employment or a new project. And what those comings together do often is lead to new ideas, to innovation. And the city is a transaction machine that leads to the creation of new ideas. And that helps us as a species stay alive, stay fresh, stay new, respond, be ready for the changing world around us. That's why cities are so important, but only if they're connected properly. And the other point I made back in January was to say the fragmented low density city, which is divided by highways, creates car dependence, creates loneliness, is the kind of city we've been building for nearly 100 years now. Whereas the historic city, which is integrated and dense, it's connected by slow boulevards, streets, is a city of walking and cycling and conviviality. It's a city that's innately healthy. So we need to stop building the city on the left and start building the city on the right. And this is these separations, these barriers are not only the barriers of highways, they can also be the very subtle metal barriers of pavements. And where but Hong Kong can we see so many of these barriers that break up the small, granular interactions and transactions that otherwise could be taking place, that take place in cities that don't have them. So almost all of my presentations and discussions, as you know, Roger, around the Biennale, have somehow involved barriers. And our first conversation, I suggested we take all the barriers down and we make something with them, a work of art or a new bridge. But we don't need them, and the good cities don't have them. The other piece to my discussion today around mobility and density is around technology. We have to think about technology not just in terms of digital, but sometimes simple technologies. The technology of the tape measure on the left is right now being used to make sure we've got enough width on our footways for the physical distancing that cities need in order for people to move comfortably with the coronavirus to avoid transmission. But then there are more complex technologies like the one on the right, spatial modeling, which my company Space Syntax has been a pioneer in over the last 30 to 40 years, developing an understanding that the way that streets connect the way that some streets are longer, straighter, and more connected and better used versus streets that are less well connected and less well used is a fundamental scientific discovery to which we can then write algorithms and build models which can replace the very complex, expensive, and opaque transport models that have led to the creation of the fragmented city. So these new mobility models are being used to understand walking and cycling as well as driving, and both at the small scale and at the large. So Space Syntax's exhibit in the Biennale is a model of Hong Kong, which is a model of its street connectivity pattern, the hot red, better connected streets, and the cold blue, less well connected streets. And it animates as it moves up and down the scale from pedestrian connectivity up to vehicle connectivity. I wanted to just mention something more on the coronavirus, because in terms of recent work, since I saw everyone in January, of course, the coronavirus has hit the world and is still hitting it. We at Space Syntax paused to say, how could we help think about this? How could we use spatial technology to help understand the spread of the disease, to offer something back? Because it seems very much like an urban disease, which seems to be very prevalent in denser cities. And we were taken back to the work of John Snow in the 19th century in London, looking at the outbreak of cholera around Soho. And he identified a water pump that was the source of the cholera epidemic. This has always fascinated me because it's the combination of a real urgent emergency with a scientific approach based on mapping. And those are the things that make me excited. How can we apply technology to key uses? So we did our own form of mapping recently, and we've created a new map of London. The issue that we thought we could help most with, or first with anyway, was around quarantine and the fact that local parts of cities might need to be locked down and the rest of the city might then be able to remain open. How could you lock down an area that was small enough so that the whole city is not adversely affected, but large enough so that those people who are locked down have access to places to shop, places to be together, as well as green spaces and open spaces? And we did this very early on in March when we really didn't know how the disease was transmitted, but it led us to a definition not based around political boundaries, not based around postcodes, because people don't know when they cross a political boundary between one local government and the next. They don't know when they cross from one postal zone to another. Those are artificial constructs. We said, how do you define a city based around natural features? So in London, it was around the canal system, it was around the railway system, those natural barriers between areas. And then we refined an algorithm to create these neighborhood areas. And we offered this as a way of thinking through what would happen if there was an outbreak in red here. In fact, we took the same location as in the 19th century around Soho. And we then used the government's scale for lockdown, highest lockdown in red in level 5. And we thought, well, maybe there could be a concentric distancing away from the lockdown where the conditions that people have to adhere to might vary. What happens if there's a second outbreak? What happens if there's an outbreak across a city where you might have to lock down that city, but not necessarily parts of the country around it? So we're using large-scale national spatial modeling. And indeed, we have a city in the UK, Leicester, which has recently had to be locked down in its entirety. So we're now seeing this sort of analysis come to the fore. At a completely different scale, though, we've also seen the fact that during the coronavirus, people have stopped driving because they're not commuting to work, and cities and towns have had far much more walking and cycling happening in them. And that's been a real revelation. If you like, it's the silver lining to the terrible problem of the coronavirus. In the town I'm here now in Faversham, in Kent, 50 miles outside of London, we've been able, using emergency legislation, to introduce a 20 miles an hour speed limit, a 30 kilometer an hour speed limit across the town. And that is something that was being planned anyway, but is now happening much faster than it would have done across the entire town. And to make it happen, we actually used some of that John Snow thinking back from the 19th century, and we asked people to place a dot on the map where they felt unsafe. So what was their feeling? What was their mental feeling about crossing the road? Where did they feel most at risk where they crossed the road? We thought we would identify one or two junctions. In fact, we identified across the entire town, people feel afraid. So this map here isn't digital, it's actually paper. And those red dots are little red stickers. And the sheet of paper is about the size of an A1 large sheet of paper. And it became a piece of scientific evidence, if you like, social science, that demonstrated to political leaders that the community wanted this to happen. And I'm pleased to say that we've recently found out that it has been approved and it'll be going in the next month or two. So this, if you like, is an upside, along with other little measures, like at the moment, there's no pedestrian crossing here on this street. So we've been campaigning to have one. And now, as a result of COVID, this little improvement is happening to give people a place to cross the road. And this really is a message about the architecture of the city. The architecture of the city need not be the star-architecture of the city. It need not be about trophy buildings and trophy public spaces. The real architecture of the city, for me, are these small interventions that collectively produce a huge good. And that, whether it's improving, intensifying, or extending, is the approach which I just want to spend a few minutes more to talk further about. Let's start with improve, then we'll go on to intensify, then let's go on to extend. And I just want to offer some case studies from London, but also from some other cities of where we've been able to propose improvements. Starting in London, this is a long time ago now. This is 24 years ago since Trafalgar Square in London looked like this. A blank wall separating the National Gallery of Art in the background from Trafalgar Square, the centre of London, literally the centre of Britain, where distance is measured. And yet it was an empty place because of this barrier. The proposal was to put a new staircase into that square to let people flow through the square in new ways. This was the CGI that was made by Norman Foster's firm, Foster and Partners, at the time. And I'm pleased to say it was built and it worked. I say and it worked because another important lesson I think that architects need to understand is not everything that happens the way they want it. So much of our architecture fails. So much of our public space design has failed to deliver the artist's impression of the planning proposals. And our risk mitigation, risk avoidance technique is to use technology. So in intensifying and improving the use of Trafalgar Square, we used a very primitive pedestrian movement model back in 1996, but very effective to show before the hot lines of movement went around the square because that was the easy route around. But by opening the staircase, you can see those hot red lines can now pass through the middle. That was the useful justification for the proposals. We've learned more and moved on since then. And if I move to the Middle East, to the city of Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, we've been helping that city for many years now, starting with improving, then intensifying, then growing. Improving, we said, well, one of the biggest problems of the city is the unplanned, informal settlements that have taken place without formal planning. They're sometimes referred to as slums, but in fact, many of them have higher quality standards than that word suggests. Now, modeling the connectivity of these places shows that they are highly, highly walkable locally. And in that sense, the quality of life in some of these places was something that we wanted to celebrate and not lose when these places were improved. Because often improvement is thought of as clearing out the way and starting again. We said, no, understand how these places might be separated from the highway system of the city. The highways just fly by the side of them. So what you need to do is to connect those two movement scales so that people in their cars can pull over and stop. People walking can then trade out to the people who've pulled over in their cars and stopped. And that means designing the outside of the unplanned settlement and then allowing pathways through. So the design was based on a mobility analysis and based on a strong conviction that we weren't going to demolish these places. We were actually going to improve them and connect them outwards into the city. Different versions of that depending upon how much money we have to invest in these places, not we, but the city and the occupants of these places, guided also by the thought that improvement might just mean planting trees and creating shade and lowering the temperature and encouraging people to walk. And in any hot climate, planting trees to reduce air temperature is such a sensible thing to do. And given the climate emergency, it's the necessary thing to do. So it's always this idea about the outcome that we want to achieve as a vision, as a visual manifestation, a sketch of an outcome, but backed up by the science and the technology of integrated urban models. So if you like, this is the core product which helps us understand which parts of the city are going to be more intensely used, which are going to be less intensely used. How can we balance movement across them? If you make everyone live in one part of the city and make everyone work in another part of the city, you're going to get a lot of movement. Why do we do that? Well, because 100 years ago, planners decided that was the safest thing to do, to zone the city with the industrial, dirty, smelly, polluting part at one end and the cleaner place upwind where people should live. Industry is different now. It's no longer dirty, smelly, and polluting in the main in cities. So we don't need to separate them anymore. We don't need to create all of the congestion that has then been created. We can think differently about how we locate things, and locating things really matters. And in this case, I put this slide in because it's about the location of doctors' surgeries, something that I think architects, urbanists might not think about immediately, but actually whether people can access not just one doctor, but do they have a choice of accessing on foot a good doctor and several good doctors? The data on the quality of the general practitioner practice and the distance from where people live is something that we put into a model in order to reveal just the problem that this particular part of London had, that most of its population lived distant from a good doctor. So rather than necessarily changing anything physical, we might just actually want to relocate or train or improve those doctors. So further improvements just might be about extending and filling in a little gap in a low density housing estate. I've moved now to Astana in Kazakhstan, where we've been working on a master plan for the whole city, but it's been about starting with improvements, then we're going to come to intensify, and eventually we'll extend it. So those improvements might just be about filling in a gap on the street. It might just be about broadening the base of a building to put a shop there, where at the moment there's a blank wall, to activate the street and make it feel more humane. It might, as you've seen here, be about planting trees. It might be about larger projects. The riverbanks in Astana are blank places where the water gushes through when it floods. By planting them, you can slow the water down, control the flooding, but also create terraces outside of the flood season where people can sit and enjoy. So one investment can have multiple purposes. Working with the city, we've been identifying where those improvements will have greatest effect. Let me jump back to Hong Kong briefly, because improvements in Hong Kong might be small scale. Why do we have so many of these bridges when actually the life of the city is down at street level? A lot of people say Hong Kong needs multiple levels because there's so many people living there. I disagree with that statement across much of Hong Kong. Certainly in central and in the very dense areas, you do need multiple levels. But sometimes these bridges have just been built because the traffic engineer said that was the right thing to do. And the evidence that I've got to support what I'm saying is look at the ground level. It's mostly empty. There's plenty of space at ground level to bring the city down to that slower, more generous place for pedestrians that we've seen work. And of course, as barriers have been removed through recent events in Hong Kong, we've seen different styles of movement, when I was in Hong Kong in January, a far more comfortable way of walking across the street, not feeling like you're an animal in a pen, but actually being allowed to flow according to your natural desire lines. Once we've improved what we've already got, let's think about intensifying it. Intensification has to address the problem of low density that's been created by planning in the last century. Low density planning has created car dependence. Car dependence has created loneliness, huge mental health problems. We've been able to work with a mental health charity in the UK to understand just how profound this is. But by mapping where people have said they feel more or less lonely onto where people are more or less car dependent, we can begin to understand how these things relate. When you're at a time of life where you can't drive, you're living somewhere on your own, you have no social network around you, loneliness is what results. And we have to understand that in building car dependence, we're creating damaging health conditions. So how can we subsidize transport? How can we add public transport? How could we discount a taxi fare to someone in a lonely location to give them the ability to get beyond where they currently are? Because we can't just build in the low density places necessarily. That is a very expensive way of dealing with the problem. But when we do build, if we've got sufficient density, how do we intensify the center of our cities with public transport? So back in Astana, we're putting in public transport, a monorail system, intensifying the use of the street, very broad streets that are windy and empty and cold in the winter and hot in the summer. How do we plant trees, put public transport in, intensify the use of them, using our analytics to identify where the route should go? So finally, in the last couple of minutes, how do we extend a city? How can we use technology to grow a city in a healthy way? Well, first of all, we ask ourselves the question, what are the building blocks of urban planning? In here, you'll see there are no trophy buildings. There are no, it's important to have a key building, an icon, but actually most of the city is about streets. Most of the city is humble. Most of the city is about the spatial network, the plots that people are going to live and work in, the plot typologies in terms of how tall they are, how dense they are, whether they are places to live or work or both. And then lastly, the services. How do we place schools? How do we place public transport, doctors' practices, public spaces? Modeling allows us to do some interesting things. Because we've understood the importance of street connectivity, as I said right at the beginning, to the way that people flow, we've been able to understand that more connected streets create better footfall. Better footfall creates higher property values. You can build a model to describe this. And so in this particular case in Australia, we're extending the city over on the right-hand side. We have calculated 3.7 billion Australian dollars of value being created by this development, by building a new kind of model that measures the intensity of the connectivity and the outcomes that we're going to get. Extending the city into its new places, we've actually used some artificial intelligence to build on all of the research findings that we've made over the decades to try to grow the city using AI. And I just wanted to show you some of our experimentation to finish. First of all, we understand at the bottom of this image is our site. We're going to grow the existing city at the top down towards the bottom right. We need to understand where that site is likely to flood first. So that's the blue areas. We might not want to build on those, or we might need to treat them. Secondly, we have a motorway going around the outside of the city. That has a negative impact, the sound of the cars. The red lines are the landing and takeoff acoustic cone from the airport. We need to be aware of where the airport is. That again might influence, or does influence, where we're going to put our buildings. We don't put tall buildings under that cone. We don't necessarily want to put too much residential space under that zone because of the noise that it would create. Then where is the high quality soil that we want to make sure that we don't necessarily build over? Put all of those things together to create a multifaceted parametric model. We can start to identify the prime land and the less prime land. Then we identify the points where the new city can connect and plug into the existing city. Because places work, developments work, extensions work according to the quality of the connections they make into the existing place. So we identify those, and then we release the agents in the model, and these are trying to find the simplest, most connected routes from all of those points of entry to the other points of exit onto the motorway, and thinking about where the city might grow beyond. And we let these agents run overnight. We then run an optimizing algorithm on them, which says, how do we turn all of those random paths into a simple network of streets, as you might see in a city? Having established that primary foreground grid of streets, we then say, well, what about the secondary streets, the local places where people might want to live? And we do the same sort of thing. We run an optimizing algorithm to identify those. And then we carry on and say, well, where could the more or less dense places be? More dense in green, less dense in red. And then going right down to the detail of an individual public block and saying, according to the kind of investment, the kind of land use, how might the plot sizes vary across all of that? And that ultimately gives us a plan for the commercial parts of the city, the residential parts of the city, the less dense parts of the city, that all connect and integrate to create the proposal in the master plan for Astana that then connects back into the public transport network and gives us a vision of a new place built on those good principles of connected, walkable public space to create that transaction machine that I started with. So I hope that was a helpful contribution, and I look forward to carrying on the discussion after Federico's presentation.
Great. I've been making copious notes while you're speaking, and I will keep that up my sleeve because I've already been receiving some questions on the floor already. So this is great. Thank you very much, Tim, and we shall, as you said, hear from Federico first, and then we'll have a further discussion. So thank you, Tim.